But we begin tonight with questions still swirling regarding 3 children that investigators say were abandoned for years inside a Pontiac home. Where was the mom living that whole time?
All the way down the counters, feces throughout the kitchen as well.
Was there any odor while you were walking through the home?
Yes, it was very foul. Our initial thought was we were checking the apartment for a dead body.
Did you speak with the middle child?
Yes.
Where did you speak to her?
Also in the backseat of a different car.
On the morning of February 14, 2025, Oakland County deputies entered a modest home in Pontiac, Michigan, expecting to carry out a routine welfare check. What they found inside would leave even the most experienced officers traumatized. The house was overflowing with rotting garbage, human waste, and the unbearable stench of decay. But it wasn't just the filth. It was who was trapped inside. 3 children, ages 15, 13, and 12, covered in feces, starving and silent. One girl was sleeping on flattened pizza boxes. The toilet hadn't worked in years. The bathtub had become a makeshift latrine, and not a single adult was present. The children hadn't seen the outside world in nearly 5 years. They hadn't been to school, a doctor, or even a park. Their mother, Kelli Bryant, lived just miles away, groomed, manicured, and living a separate life. She had sacrificed them. But this story doesn't begin with that horrifying discovery. It begins nearly 5 years earlier, when the world stopped turning, and a global pandemic gave one mother the perfect cover to commit an unthinkable crime against her own children. Kelli Bryant was 29 years old when the first reports of a mysterious virus began emerging from distant corners of the world. A single mother of 3 living in Pontiac, Michigan, she appeared to be navigating the same challenges as millions of other parents across America. Her children, a bright 10-year-old boy and 2 young daughters ages 8 and 7, were attending school regularly and living what seemed to be an ordinary childhood in their modest family home. The Bryant family, like countless others, had no way of knowing that March 2020 would mark a turning point that would fundamentally alter the course of human history. When Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer issued the state's first stay-at-home order on March 23, 2020, families across the state found themselves thrust into an unprecedented reality. Schools closed their doors with little warning. Parents scrambled to arrange childcare or work from home. Children who had been following predictable routines of education and social interaction suddenly found themselves confined to their homes, participating in hastily arranged remote learning programs or simply waiting for normalcy to return. For most families, this period brought challenges but also unexpected opportunities for togetherness. Parents and children spent more time together than they had in years. Families played board games, cooked meals together, and discovered new ways to connect, while the world outside remained unpredictable and dangerous. For the Bryant children, however, this period marked the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across nearly 5 years and transform their childhood home into a prison of unimaginable neglect. The pandemic created what experts would later describe as the perfect storm of circumstances that allowed Kelli Bryant to systematically abandon her children while maintaining the illusion that everything was normal. School districts, overwhelmed by the sudden transition to remote learning and struggling with technological challenges, found it nearly impossible to track student attendance with their previous precision. Teachers who might have noticed a student's prolonged absence were dealing with spotty internet connections, technical difficulties, and their own personal challenges during an unprecedented global crisis. Social distancing guidelines provided ready-made explanations for why families weren't seeing each other regularly. Extended family members who might have questioned the children's absence had perfectly reasonable explanations for maintaining distance. Neighbors, focused on their own survival during uncertain times and encouraged to limit social interactions, were less likely to notice unusual patterns in the house next door. Child protective services, already stretched thin under normal circumstances, found themselves operating with reduced capacity as workers adapted to new safety protocols and dealt with a surge in domestic violence and child abuse cases related to pandemic stress. The normal safety nets that might have caught signs of neglect were either dismantled entirely or operating at significantly reduced effectiveness. It was against this backdrop of global chaos and systemic disruption that Kelli Bryant made a decision that would haunt her children for the rest of their lives. Sometime between 2020 and 2021, as the world struggled to adapt to a new reality, Bryant chose to move out of the family home, leaving her 3 young children to fend for themselves in what would gradually transform from a place of shelter into a monument to human cruelty. The children, trusting their mother and having no frame of reference for what constituted normal parental care during such extraordinary times, initially believed this arrangement was temporary. Perhaps Mom was sick and needed to isolate. Perhaps this was just how families worked now that the whole world had changed. Perhaps she would be back soon to resume her role as their protector and provider. They had no way of knowing that their mother was embarking on a deliberate campaign of abandonment that would leave them isolated, malnourished, and living in conditions that would eventually require hazmat suits for trained professionals to navigate safely. They couldn't understand that the woman they trusted most in the world had chosen to prioritize her own comfort and freedom over their most basic needs for safety, nutrition, and human connection. The pandemic had indeed created the perfect storm, not just of circumstances that would allow such systematic abuse to continue undetected, but of innocence and trust that would prevent these children from recognizing their abandonment as the crime it was until it was far too late to call for help. As 2020 became 2021 and 2021 stretched into 2022, the Bryant children's world grew, smaller and darker with each passing day. Their mother's physical presence, which had once provided them with security and stability, became nothing more than a memory. The house that had once represented home and safety gradually transformed into their entire universe, a universe that was collapsing around them, while the rest of the world remained completely unaware of their suffering. The perfect storm had begun, and 3 innocent children were about to endure years of systematic abandonment that would challenge everything society believed about the bonds between mothers and children and expose catastrophic failures in every system designed to protect the most vulnerable members of our community. Kelli Bryant's abandonment of her children wasn't a sudden explosion of cruelty. It was a calculated, methodical erosion of care that happened so gradually her young victims didn't recognize it as abandonment until escape had become psychologically impossible. What began as temporary absences during a global pandemic evolved into a sophisticated system of control that would keep 3 children imprisoned in their own home for nearly 5 years. The transformation began with Bryant establishing what she would later describe to investigators as necessary rules for the children's safety. She explicitly instructed them never to leave the house under any circumstances and never to answer the door if someone knocked. To children who had already spent months in pandemic lockdown, these instructions didn't seem unreasonable. The outside world had become dangerous, full of invisible threats that could make them sick or worse. If Mum said they needed to stay inside, then staying inside was what kept them safe. What the children couldn't understand was that these weren't temporary pandemic precautions. They were the foundational elements of a prison system designed to keep them isolated while their mother lived an entirely separate life just miles away. Bryant's method of maintaining control over her children was both sophisticated and deliberately cruel. She established text message communication exclusively with her eldest son, the 15-year-old boy, who would become the conduit for all information between mother and children. These communications were sporadic and utilitarian, focused primarily on logistics rather than care or emotional connection. There were no good morning messages, no expressions of love, no inquiries about their well-being. The texts served one purpose: to maintain just enough contact to ensure the children remained compliant with her abandonment. The psychological impact of this communication structure cannot be overstated. The children lived in constant fear of their mother's reaction if they disobeyed her instructions. They had no way of knowing when she might appear, when she might call, or what consequences would follow if they failed to meet her expectations. This state of perpetual anxiety created what experts would later describe as a form of psychological torture, where the threat of punishment was often more damaging than punishment itself. Bryant's logistical approach to keeping her children alive, while maintaining her abandonment, was as calculated as it was minimal. She arranged weekly food deliveries through DoorDash and Instacart, providing just enough sustenance to keep them breathing, but never enough for them to thrive. There was no nutritional planning, no consideration for the dietary needs of growing teenagers, no acknowledgement that proper development requires more than the bare minimum calories for survival. Even more telling was what she deliberately withheld. The children received no hygiene products, no soap, no toilet paper, no shampoo, no toothbrushes. This wasn't an oversight or a consequence of poverty. It was a deliberate choice to deny them the basic tools of human dignity. When her daughters began menstruating during their imprisonment, Bryant provided pads exactly once, leaving them to navigate this fundamental aspect of growing up without guidance, supplies, or support. While her children struggled to maintain basic human dignity, in increasingly horrific conditions, Bryant was living an entirely different existence. She maintained a well-groomed appearance that would later shock investigators with its stark contrast to her children's condition. Her hair was professionally styled, her clothes were clean and fashionable, her nails were expertly manicured. She was clearly investing time and money in her personal appearance while denying her children access to soap. Bryant's deception extended far beyond neglect into active fraud and manipulation. She lived nearby, close enough to monitor the situation, but far enough away to maintain complete physical separation from the consequences of her choices. When family members asked about the children, she had ready answers. They were staying with a babysitter, they were visiting relatives, they were fine and just busy with their own activities. These lies were delivered with such confidence that extended family members accepted them for years without demanding to see the children themselves. Perhaps most damning was Bryant's systematic approach to avoiding detection by emergency services. She deliberately broke the smoke detector in the home, ensuring that no fire department or emergency personnel would have reason to enter the house and discover the children's condition. This wasn't the action of someone overwhelmed by circumstances, it was the calculated behavior of someone actively concealing a crime. Throughout this period, Bryant continued collecting welfare benefits intended for her children's care, nearly $30,000 between January 2022 and February 2025. Every month she accepted money from taxpayers specifically designated to provide for children she had deliberately abandoned. Every check she cashed was both theft from the state and a betrayal of the fundamental premise that parents exist to protect and provide for their children. The system failures that enabled Bryant's systematic abuse were as staggering as the abuse itself. When the children stopped attending school in 2020, no truancy officer ever visited the home. No social worker ever conducted a welfare check. No educational professional ever followed up to ensure these young minds were continuing to develop and learn. In 2022, Bryant appeared in court for proceedings related to her fourth child and explicitly told a judge that she could not support herself or her existing children and was not capable of caring for them. This confession should have triggered immediate protective action. Instead, no wellness check was ordered, no follow-up was conducted, and the three children continued to suffer in isolation, while their mother's own words provided a roadmap for intervention that was never followed. The community's blindness to the children's plight represents perhaps the most haunting aspect of this case. Neighbors never questioned why they stopped seeing the children. Delivery drivers never wondered why food was being dropped off for inhabitants who were never visible. Utility workers, postal employees, and service providers all had opportunities to notice something was wrong, but none acted on whatever concerns they might have had. By 2023, what had begun as temporary pandemic arrangements had solidified into a permanent system of abandonment and control that would continue for 2 more years while Bryant lived freely. Maintaining her appearance and her lies, and collecting money intended for children she had systematically dehumanized and forgotten. In years, the Bryant family home had undergone a transformation so complete and horrifying that it challenged the very concept of human habitation. What had once been a modest residence where children played, learned, and grew had devolved into something that defied description, a living nightmare that would eventually require trained professionals in hazmat suits to navigate safely. The physical deterioration of the house mirrored the systematic destruction of 3 young lives. Without access to cleaning supplies, without adult supervision, and without any understanding of basic sanitation, the children watched helplessly as their environment collapsed around them. Garbage accumulated in massive piles that reached heights of 4 feet, creating mountains of rotting waste that blocked pathways and filled rooms with the stench of decay. The bathroom, which should have provided the children with their most basic human dignity, had become a monument to abandonment and neglect. The toilet, having broken down long ago without any possibility of repair, overflowed continuously, creating pools of sewage that spread throughout the house. The bathtub, rather than offering a means of maintaining cleanliness, had been transformed into a repository for human waste when the toilet became completely unusable. The children, faced with the most fundamental human needs, but lacking any guidance or resources, were forced to improvise solutions that would haunt investigators for years to come. With no functioning bathroom and no understanding of basic sanitation, they relieved themselves wherever they could, creating conditions that would eventually leave feces covering not just their clothing, but their hair and skin. Sleep, one of the most basic requirements for human development, had become an exercise in survival rather than rest. The 15-year-old boy had claimed an old mattress that provided minimal comfort, but represented luxury compared to his sister's arrangements. The two girls, aged 13 and 12, were sleeping on flattened pizza boxes, cardboard that had once delivered their meager weekly meals now serving as their beds. These were children in the prime of their physical and emotional development, trying to rest each night on materials that most people would consider garbage. The children's physical appearance told a story of systematic neglect that would move seasoned investigators to tears. Their bodies, deprived of adequate nutrition for years, had become what witnesses described as skin and bone thin. These were teenagers who should have been experiencing growth spurts and developing into healthy, young adults. Instead, malnutrition had stunted their development and left them appearing far younger and more fragile than their chronological ages suggested. Their hair, once a source of childhood pride and self-expression, had become so matted and tangled that it would have required professional intervention to restore. Without access to shampoo, brushes, or basic hair care, years of neglect had created conditions where their hair had essentially become part of the environmental contamination that surrounded them. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the evidence of how completely they had been failed in the most basic aspects of human care. Their toenails had grown so long that they struggled to walk normally, a detail that speaks to months and years of complete absence of basic grooming that most children learn before they can even tie their shoes. The girls' experience of puberty represents perhaps the cruelest aspect of their abandonment. During their years of imprisonment, both daughters began menstruating, a natural process that should have been met with guidance, support, and adequate supplies. Instead, Bryant provided menstrual pads exactly once, leaving her daughters to navigate this fundamental aspect of growing up without understanding, without supplies, and without the dignity that every young woman deserves during this vulnerable time. The psychological impact of their isolation was perhaps even more devastating than the physical neglect. The two girls hadn't left the house in years, meaning they had been completely cut off from sunlight, fresh air, and any connection to the natural world during crucial developmental years. They had no understanding of how the world had changed outside their walls, no knowledge of current events, no awareness of how their peers were growing and developing. When investigators finally discovered them, the children's lack of basic life knowledge was as shocking as their physical condition. They didn't know how to brush their teeth, not because they had forgotten, but because they had never been taught or had access to toothbrushes. They didn't understand how to flush a toilet, having lived for years without a functioning bathroom. When hospital staff provided them with basic hygiene supplies, the children were confused about their purpose and use. The eldest boy, despite having access to a cell phone throughout their ordeal, never called for help. This wasn't because he didn't understand that phones could be used for emergencies, but because years of psychological conditioning had taught him that obedience to his mother's instructions was more important than his own survival or that of his sisters. Their fear-based compliance with Bryant's abandonment had become so complete that even when rescue finally came, they struggled to understand that they were being saved rather than punished. The psychological prison their mother had constructed was so effective that even when the physical doors were opened, the children needed time to understand that they were finally free. The children had lost more than their childhood during those years of imprisonment. They had lost their understanding of what normal human relationships looked like, what adequate care felt like, and what they deserved as human beings. Their mother's systematic dehumanization had been so thorough that they would need years of intensive support to rebuild not just their physical health, but their fundamental understanding of their own worth and their right to safety, nutrition, and love. By February 2025, when deputies finally entered their home, these three children had survived nearly 5 years in conditions that most adults couldn't endure for 5 days. Their survival represented not just physical resilience, but a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, even when hope seems impossible and rescue appears to be nothing more than a distant dream. The end of Kelli Bryant's systematic reign of terror began not with a dramatic confrontation or a heroic rescue, but with the mundane concerns of an unpaid landlord who had grown tired of waiting for his monthly rent check. By October 2024, Bryant had stopped making payments on the property where her 3 children had been imprisoned for nearly 5 years. More troubling still, the landlord hadn't seen any sign of the family in months, despite the obvious signs that someone was still living in the house. For weeks, the landlord wrestled with his concerns. Property management came with its share of difficult tenants and complicated situations, but something about the Bryant property felt different. The silence was too complete, the absence too prolonged. Finally, in February 2025, his worry overcame his reluctance to involve authorities, and he placed the call that would finally bring the children's nightmare to an end. When Oakland County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the modest Pontiac home on that cold February morning, they expected to find either an empty house or perhaps a family experiencing temporary difficulties. Nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for what waited behind that door. The officers quickly realized that standard protective equipment wouldn't be sufficient for what they were about to encounter. They would need hazmat suits. Detective Brish, a veteran investigator who had seen his share of human suffering, suited up alongside his colleagues with a growing sense of dread. The smell emanating from the house was unlike anything he had experienced in his law enforcement career. As they crossed the threshold, the reality of what had been happening in this house for years began to reveal itself in horrifying detail. The 3 children, now 15, 13, and 12 years old, were discovered in conditions so deplorable that even trained professionals struggled to process what they were seeing. Detective Brish would later testify that the most notable observation was what appeared to be feces covering their clothing and their hair. These weren't children who had been neglected for days or weeks. This was evidence of systematic abandonment that had persisted for years. The children were immediately transported to the hospital for evaluation, their first contact with medical professionals in nearly half a decade. Hospital staff, accustomed to treating victims of abuse and neglect, were stunned by the extent of the children's condition. Basic medical assessments revealed malnutrition, developmental delays, and physical deterioration that spoke to years of complete medical neglect. Child Protective Services moved quickly to remove the children from the horrific environment and place them with a family member, relatives who had been successfully deceived for years about the children's whereabouts and condition. For the first time since 2020, the Bryant children would sleep in clean beds, eat nutritious meals, and experience the basic care that every child deserves. Meanwhile, investigators had begun the process of locating and arresting Kelli Bryant. When they found her, the contrast between her appearance and her children's condition was so stark that it left seasoned officers struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. While her children had been living in filth, wearing clothes, covered in feces and sleeping on pizza boxes, Bryant appeared immaculately groomed. Her hair was professionally styled, her clothes were clean and fashionable, her nails were expertly manicured. This wasn't a woman who had been struggling with mental illness or overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. This was someone who had been investing significant time and money in her personal appearance, while denying her children access to soap. During her interrogation, Bryant's responses would provide investigators with insights into her mindset that were perhaps more chilling than the physical evidence they had already gathered. When Detective Brish asked her about her children's condition, Bryant's response was as direct as it was devastating. "I sacrificed my children." The word sacrificed would haunt everyone who heard it. This wasn't language that suggested regret or mental illness. This was the language of someone who had made a deliberate calculation, weighing her own desires against her children's needs and choosing herself. Bryant continued her confession with admissions that revealed the calculated nature of her abandonment. She acknowledged that her actions were selfish and that they had made her children sick. Most damning of all, she admitted that she had sacrificed her children for her own purposes. These weren't the words of someone who had lost control or been overwhelmed by circumstances. These were the words of someone who had made a conscious choice to prioritize her own comfort over her children's survival. The legal response to Bryant's crimes was swift and severe. Prosecutors filed 3 counts of first-degree child abuse, 1 for each child, charges that carried the potential for life sentences. Additionally, they filed 3 counts of welfare fraud, documenting the nearly $30,000 in benefits Bryant had collected while abandoning the children. The money was intended to support. The court's initial assessment of Bryant as a flight risk and potential threat to the children was reflected in an unprecedented bond of $250 million. This astronomical figure sent a clear message about the severity of her crimes and the court's determination to ensure she couldn't flee or intimidate the children who would likely testify against her. The bond was later reduced to $50,000, But prosecutors simultaneously moved to terminate Bryant's parental rights, ensuring that even if she posted bond, she would have no legal claim to the children she had abandoned. The investigation that followed, Bryant's arrest, painted a picture of systematic deception and calculated cruelty. Photographers documented every room of the house, creating a visual record of the conditions that would serve as evidence in court. Medical professionals conducted comprehensive evaluations of the children, documenting not just their immediate physical condition, but the long-term developmental delays and health consequences of their years of abandonment. Financial investigators traced Bryant's fraudulent collection of welfare benefits, creating a paper trail that demonstrated she had been accepting taxpayer money specifically designated for children's care while providing no care whatsoever. Text message records confirmed that her only communication with the children had been sporadic and utilitarian, focused on maintaining control rather than providing support or affection. As news of the case spread throughout the community and beyond, one question echoed in the minds of everyone who learned about the Bryant children. How could this have happened for so long without anyone noticing? The answer would require a careful examination of every system that had failed these children, and an honest reckoning with society's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members. The spring of 2025 unfolded. The legal machinery of Oakland County began processing one of the most disturbing child abuse cases in Michigan's recent history. Kelli Bryant, now 34 years old, sat in custody facing charges that could effectively end her life as a free woman, while 3 children she had systematically abandoned began the long journey toward healing and recovery. The legal proceedings moved with deliberate precision through the court system. By late May 2025, Bryant had been bound over for trial, a crucial step that confirmed prosecutors had presented sufficient evidence to proceed with their case. The judge's decision to move forward represented a formal acknowledgement that the evidence against Bryant met the legal threshold for the serious charges she faced. Bryant's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming and largely undisputed. The photographic documentation of the children's living conditions spoke for itself. The medical evaluations provided clear evidence of systematic neglect. Bryant's own recorded admissions to Detective Brish eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence. The challenge for the defense would be finding any mitigating circumstances that might influence sentencing rather than guilt. The prosecution's case, meanwhile, was built on a foundation of irrefutable evidence that painted a picture of calculated cruelty rather than circumstantial neglect. The financial record showing Bryant's continued collection of welfare benefits while abandoning her children demonstrated deliberate fraud. The text message communications proved she had maintained sporadic contact, ruling out any claim that she had lost touch with the children due to circumstances beyond her control. Perhaps most damning was Bryant's own testimony during her police interrogation. Her admission that she had sacrificed her children for her own purposes and that her actions were selfish provided prosecutors with evidence of intent and consciousness of guilt that would be nearly impossible for any defense strategy to overcome. The children, meanwhile, were beginning their own journey through a different kind of legal process. Prosecutors had moved aggressively to terminate Bryant's parental rights, ensuring that regardless of the outcome of the criminal trial, she would have no legal claim to custody or visitation with the children she had abandoned. This parallel legal process represented society's determination to protect these children from any future contact with their abuser. Community response to the case had been swift and generous. Local organizations and individuals rallied to provide clothing, toys and other necessities for children who had been deprived of basic comforts for years. The children, described by those who met them as articulate but frightened, were slowly adapting to a world that included regular meals, clean clothes, and adults who prioritized their well-being. The children's placement with family members provided stability, but also raised difficult questions about how relatives had remained unaware of their situation for so long. The extended family's claims that they had been successfully deceived by Bryant's lies highlighted the sophisticated nature of her deception, but also underscored how completely the children had been isolated from any potential support network. Medical and psychological evaluations revealed the full extent of the damage inflicted by nearly 5 years of systematic abandonment. Beyond the obvious physical neglect, the children faced challenges that would require years of intensive support to address. Their confusion when presented with basic hygiene supplies at the hospital demonstrated how completely they had been deprived of normal childhood experiences and education. The systemic failures that had enabled Bryant's crimes became a focus of community discussion and policy review. The school district's failure to follow up on the children's prolonged absence raised questions about truancy policies and the effectiveness of student tracking systems. The fact that Bryant had explicitly told a court in 2022 that she couldn't care for her children, yet no protective action had been taken, highlighted gaps in communication between different branches of the legal system. Social services agencies began reviewing their protocols for welfare check procedures and interagency communication. The case demonstrated how easily children could disappear from official oversight, particularly during periods of social disruption like the COVID-19 pandemic. As Bryant awaited trial with no set court date, the community grappled with the broader implications of her crimes. This wasn't a case of momentary poor judgment or temporary overwhelm that many parents might recognize in themselves. This was systematic, calculated abandonment that had persisted for years, while the perpetrator maintained her own comfort and appearance. The children's survival represented not just physical resilience, but a testament to the human capacity to endure unimaginable circumstances. Their ability to articulate their experiences to investigators and medical professionals, despite years of educational neglect, suggested an inner strength that would serve them well in their recovery. Legal experts watching the case noted that Bryant's recorded confessions and the overwhelming physical evidence made conviction on the child abuse charges virtually certain. The only remaining questions centered on sentencing and whether the charges would run concurrently or consecutively. For the children, the legal proceedings represented both an opportunity for justice and a continued reminder of their trauma. Their journey toward recovery would extend far beyond whatever sentence Bryant ultimately received. They would need years of educational support to address the schooling they had missed, medical care to address the physical consequences of their neglect, and psychological support to help them understand that they deserved care, safety, and love. The case of Kelli Bryant and her abandoned children serves as a stark reminder of society's obligation to protect its most vulnerable members. It demonstrates how quickly children can disappear from sight when multiple systems fail simultaneously, and how important it is for communities to remain vigilant about the welfare of all children, not just those in their immediate families. As this story continues to unfold in courtrooms and counseling offices, it stands as both a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a call to action for anyone who believes that every child deserves the basic dignity of food, shelter, safety, and love.